My man, what's up?
My man. Ceylon cinnamon.
Yep. I know all about that.
Ceylon cinnamon.
Totally.
I just bought some, and on the package it says most cinnamon claims to be Ceylon cinnamon, but it's not. It's like a mixture of 4 other types of cinnamon plus some other additives. But Ceylon is like pure cinnamon. You buy the sticks, and then I grind it up. It's really tasty. And it is there are claims, and actually validated claims from the medical community. If you go to like PubMed, you can look this up, that Ceylon cinnamon actually helps with insulin sensitivity. So if you have some Ceylon cinnamon before your meal, and I don't remember how much you need to take to affect your insulin sensitivity, but if you have it before a meal, during a meal, or after a meal, it can actually help with that. So for people like me that have a familial propensity towards diabetes, and insulin spikes are not a good thing, Ceylon cinnamon can reduce and or lower those spikes.
So I want to be very clear. I had never heard of that before. But sounds good. Welcome to, or welcome back to, More in Common. This is our social experiment. See, everyone has a story that can help us learn from one another. And we bring people into this safe space that we have learned to create so we can learn about their stories and get into difficult topics that challenge us in conversation and ultimately how we think.
And we have a lot of these conversations, and we're seeing a lot of similar threads through all of them. So what we're doing is breaking down these conversations to create a set of tools and a map that'll help you become a conversation boss so that you can be a catalyst for conversation in your day-to-day life. Get out to www.moreincommonpod.com to find all things More in Common. All of it. Like, pretty much everything. So, yeah. That's my plug there. Share it if you sharing is caring. I truly believe that. We believe that. So share it if you feel inspired to do so. And before we get into today's episode, like we always do, we like to look back at the previous episode and talk about what touched us, what moved us, what we've been thinking about. And Keith, we just had Q. What'd you take away from that conversation?
Well, I'm glad you used my name because it's something that I think about a lot is we don't really use each other's name too much. Like we don't introduce ourselves or anything like that. But just a diversion here for a second.
Oh, that's interesting. We just started talking. Like so people are like, we don't know who Keith is.
Who's Keith? Who's Rodney? Like get to know our voices, I guess. But yeah.
I'm going to over-index. I'm like, hey, Keith, what do you think about that, Keith?
You know how I feel about my name being used.
Well, how do you feel, Keith? Do you like it when people say Keith?
So as far as Q goes, though, like one of my favorite things in the conversation is how much he talks about athletes in a way of admiration. And that's his female athletes, right? Like he talks about them in such adulation, and it is just an awesome thing, right, when it comes to creating space for equality, especially in sports. I love his pragmatic nature too, of just the idea of males coaching females in football, based on just the historical context of access and playing of the sport. So those were two. There's just a lot of goodness, and just a lot of goodness from Q in general. Just it's kind of like Jamil, right? Like just that vibe is just, it feels good talking to him. But those were two things that really stuck with me. Yeah,
interesting. Something about locks that just makes you like a big hard person.
Or maybe it's just people with locks who are just really, really welcoming and chill. So let's break down that bias.
As for me, I would agree, man. Like Q's heart and his fact that he's getting out there and doing things. And I don't think I mentioned this in the episode. I talked to him afterwards. I really like that his ministry is getting out into the streets and helping people that need help, and like doing the things that a lot of churches talk about but don't. Some do, and some do, and
Sure.
they should be committed, but others don't. And I just think that's like, I feel like we would be better off if more churches didn't exist as a building and they just existed as people going out and helping people. And yeah, so I commend him for that and love it, and it inspires me to do more through this platform that we're doing, because I think like just connecting people like this and trying to help people manage conversations and show up is a version of that. But yeah, he's inspirational. Yeah. So who is the guest for today?
Oh, today we have Pete Mulroy.
Pete grew up outside of Detroit, Michigan. After graduating with a degree in astrophysics and a stint with NASA, he returned to graduate school to study planetary atmospheres, to launch a sounding rocket, and to work at JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He has a deep passion for history and understanding what the past means for today. He now lives in Italy, as he has always been a dual citizen, gracing people with his knowledge of Roman history as a city tour guide. So talking to Pete is always an opportunity to learn and have a great discussion. I'm glad we could have him with us.
We talk about his interest in U.S. politics since he's been in Italy for 20 years, or the last 20 years. We talk about what it's like talking about politics in Italy and how they approach difficult conversations versus here in the U.S. His growing up and kind of his path to JPL, Jet Propulsion Lab, and then going off to Italy. And in there's some interesting stuff about like him working for women, and him, like all the black people he knew had PhDs. So like when people were, there's just real cool conversations in there. And we get into a lot of other stuff. So I'm going to stop and let you guys just get into it.
Any observations before they do?
Pete's smart. He's really smart. There's that. Yeah. I always enjoy talking to him. I also enjoy taking tours with him. So like if you're in Italy, if you're going to be in Rome or near Rome, he does tours outside of Rome as well. I am definitely plugging the hell out of him. He doesn't pay me for this yet. I think if I do it right, I could maybe set that up. But I would highly recommend doing a tour with Pete, like for reals. What about you on the conversation tip side?
Curiosity. Anytime there are some of our pillars that are in an episode, curiosity is one of our pillars. I always call it out, right? Like just asking more questions to understand and dig deeper, right? Like sometimes you just don't understand what someone's saying, and just asking a little bit more clarity helps level set where the conversation is. And a second one, like just effective disagreement, right? Like being able to listen, understand, present your point, do so in a polite fashion that ultimately creates the space that can keep the conversation going and keep everybody in a safe place. And we do that very well when we start talking about term limits, because we talk about politics in this episode. So just listen for that, right? And how that all navigates. So with that being said, enjoy the show as always, and pass along any feedback if you ever have any.
Here in Italy, you talk about everything, especially the things that you're not supposed to talk about. Those are the most interesting. And where in the States, it doesn't seem you can have civil discourse anymore. You're in one tribe or another. Here in Italy, we're still willing to have the conversations, even if they're uncomfortable, that in the States people avoid just because, well, your tribe believes that, my tribe believes this. We don't communicate anymore. I get to meet a lot of people. I mean, I try writing. Nobody's bought my stuff yet. And I always joke, because I wrote a screenplay, nobody bought it. I wrote a novel, nobody bought it. Somebody asked me what kind of writing pays best, and I just joke, I assume ransom notes. But maybe we'll try that next. But
here with I'm not here, we're remote, but got my co-host Keith, and we are here with Pete Mulroy today. Pete, how are you?
I couldn't be better.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Keith, if you don't mind, I would love to just jump in. Or do you want
off the top? I have questions to ask, but go for it.
Well, you mentioned something to us in our little preamble about being really interested in U.S. elections right now. It's strange because you don't live in the U.S. right now.
No, I haven't lived in the U.S. for quite some time. Half of the last 20 years I've lived in Italy. And, of course, Italy keeps us entertained with our own politics. Yeah. But I'm just fascinated by what's going on in the States. Probably because, I grew up in the States. I still have the same 35-cent pocket Constitution that I bought when I was in kindergarten. And it's funny because it shows you how old it is. They put the Equal Rights Amendment in my pocket Constitution. They were just so sure it was going to pass.
Wow. I have one of those. I don't think it was 35 cents, but I have one. So being that you've spent that much time in Italy in the last 20 years, why are you so interested in are you more interested in the current election cycle, so the 2018 midterm election cycle, than you have been in any other recent American elections, or what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I still have family in the States. I have 10 nephews and nieces that I care about deeply in the States. But when I left, the last time I left Italy, the States, the first time in the 90s. I had moved back to the States after my mother had passed away. I went back basically for the funeral and didn't leave for a few years. And but when I came back here permanently again, I was during President Obama's tenure. And I'm like, well, the States are in good hands. Don't have to worry about my nephews and nieces. The future is going to be fine. But just the last 2 years of just truth isn't truth. Science doesn't matter. It's how you feel. Experts aren't considered. It's, I'm president and you're not kind of thing. It's very disconcerting.
What's that like generally? I mean, obviously Italy has its own interesting political climate these days.
Berlusconi much?
What is it like in being in Italy while this is all going on? Do other people care about it? Is it more a personal interest?
It's hard to get away from. I mean, so obviously I do walking tours in Italy of Rome and the surrounding area. So I get a lot of English speakers, which means a lot of Americans, a lot of Brits with their Brexit, Australians, South Africans, anyone who speaks English. And it's always a topic on hand. And Americans, I mean, it's always on their mind as well. And then my Italian friends, because politics, in the States, you're told never to talk about religion or politics, but it's usually because other people are afraid you're going to learn something. Where here in Italy, you talk about everything, especially the things that you're not supposed to talk about. Those are the most interesting. And where in the States, it doesn't seem you can have civil discourse anymore. You're in one tribe or another. Here in Italy, we're still willing to have the conversations, even if they're uncomfortable, that in the States people avoid just because, well, your tribe believes that, my tribe believes this. We don't communicate anymore.
This is interesting. What's that like? Like, is it people that sit at coffee shops and they just have conversations and everybody kind of walks away, disagree regardless? Is it, how does that play out culturally? Or do you just see it more civilly on your tours, like on a day-to-day basis? Because this is ultimately something that we're trying to help bring the States to or back to. But seeing it, you're saying it exists elsewhere. I'm curious what that looks like.
Well, with the American tourists, they try to be more polite, but then if it gets heated, it's this is it, and that's it. So it's like, I believe in this. I will not change my mind based on what you're saying. Where in Italy, it's usually over dinner, which lasts a few hours. And so it's not like there's a time limit. It's you're eating, you're talking, and somebody says something that's provoking, other people will respond. They may not agree. And it's, you may have family members where one person, is vehemently, and this is Italy, so maybe they're very liberal, almost to the point where you'd call them a communist, where there's other people at the table that are very far to the right where you'd almost call them a fascist. Obviously, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I'm just saying it's a broad spectrum where there's some people who are the old Christian Democrats, some, you mentioned Berlusconi, the Forza Italia type people, and then there's people like the Cinque Stelle, the very popularist movement, and they're all sitting at the table, all disagreeing, and these are Italians, so it could be loud and hands are waving, but
Sure.
Nobody's going away as an enemy. Where in the States, it's people don't talk to other people anymore just because of who they voted for or the opinions that they hold.
This is, and I want to take a pivot from where you come, but this is an interesting point because oftentimes a lot of people will say, well, this is just the way people are, right? This is just how people are. When based on that, anecdotal evidence, we'll call it, it's not a human condition. It's a cultural condition. It's a cultural condition that we permeate or perpetuate every single day by just saying, oh, it is what it is. So why change it? So it's fascinating. That's really interesting.
Before we go too far down that, because I got more questions there.
So many.
Tell us a little bit about your background. You're from the States. I know you're from Michigan.
Yeah, I mean, I was physically born in New Orleans. My mother and father had met in Italy. My mother grew up during World War II. Actually, it's strange. For my age, all my friends' dads fought in Vietnam. My father fought in World War II. My mother's town was occupied by Germans during World War II. After the war, many years after the war, my dad was an engineer. They were putting missiles in Greece, Turkey, and Italy before the Cuban Missile Crisis. My dad came through my mom's hometown on Easter with a buddy. That's where they met, and they got married. They moved. They were living in Turkey, and then when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, part of the deal was Americans would remove their missiles from Cuba. Not Cuba, the Russians from Cuba, but the Americans from Turkey, Greece, and Italy. So they ended up going to New Orleans because that's when the space program was going on. My dad was still an engineer. They were building boosters this time for the space program, and instead of nuclear missiles, and they were floating the boosters from New Orleans to the Cape. So that's when I came on the scene, but I don't remember this period, too young. After the space program, it was Detroit and tanks. So he moved back home to Detroit, and that's where my first memories in life are, growing up in Michigan. And then after school, I spent most of my time in California, came to Italy, with my mother on holidays. My dad had passed away, right after high school had finished. And then and during these trips, it just, I went to school, got a degree in astrophysics, worked at NASA at Goddard Space Flight Center, went back to grad school, then ended up getting married and moving to California, working at the Jet Propulsion Lab.
JPL.
Things didn't work out exactly. Great place. I always say it's a toy store for adults. I mean, because some of the crazy things that they come up with. So then after our project ran out, the WIP Pick 2, the Wide Field Planetary Camera 2, John Traugers was the PI. I had to think about something else to do. Didn't want to make a long commitment because my marriage had ended and I had taken the job basically for my wife. She wanted to move to California. So then after that, I made a movie, didn't go anywhere. And I was doing, a lot of things. I was writing, doing some web work, but taking a lot of vacations to Italy with my mother because she wasn't doing so well. And then just realized, this always felt more like at home. I'm talking to you right now, literally next door to where my aunt lives, 2 doors down is my cousin. My mother grew up like 20 meters from here. So it's this always felt a lot like home.
Hey,
so it's
for the
very comfortable
Americans, can you convert that into feet?
just down the hall.
Just multiply by 3.3.
So wait,
Yeah.
you go from JPL, your project ends, and then you go and make a movie?
Yeah.
What movie?
Actually-
what was that? Like, why that transition?
Okay, I mean, it was just all these transitions were going on, trying to figure out what to do. I was up in Big Bear Lake, and through friends, met new friends. And there was a guy, Jay Schillinger, and he had written a screenplay, The Marksman, that Hemdale had bought. Hemdale had won a couple Academy Awards, I think one for Platoon and one for The Last Emperor. And he goes bankrupt. So my buddy gets the screenplay back. And, well, he's my buddy now. He wasn't at the time. And he's up there. We're sitting around, playing volleyball and drinking, just hanging out. And he's like, what can I do? And I'm like, well, we'll make it. And he asked me, what do you know about making movies? I'm like, nothing. But at one time I couldn't walk or talk, and I learned that pretty easily. And then I'm like, 3 years ago, I knew nothing about launching rockets, and I learned that. I'm like, it's a movie. Other people have done it. We can do it. And within a year and a half, I remember showed up in his mother's basement with, a couple boxes of office supplies. And within a few months of that, had, 100 people working for us and had all the agreements with all the unions, the labs, the, Panasonic and so on. So it just seemed like another project.
So this complete pivot, maybe I'm doing a Rodney. I couldn't walk and talk, but I learned that pretty easily. Never have I thought about anything like that. Is that like a philosophy of yours? Do you think, is that how you go about taking on challenges? Because I think, it's just kind of one of those that makes a lot of sense.
Light bulb moment.
Like a serious light bulb.
Ronnie, you have an infant, right?
Mm-hmm. So does Keith.
I mean, you look at...
Yeah, so do I.
Okay, you look at a baby. I mean, when it's born, I've never had one, but I've had my nephews and nieces, but you look at them, they're incapable of doing anything except for eating, sleeping, and defecating, and that's about it. Within 2 years, they're walking around. Within a year or two after that, they're speaking in complete sentences. So none of us remember how we did that, but we all did that. And to me, that seems very difficult. Going from a clean slate of nothing to be able to walk and talk, that seems very difficult. So I always think if I can do that, then, learning some math or learning.
It's interesting because, a lot of people beat themselves up like they're not doing well in life and they can't learn and this, that, and the other. And it's like, but the evidence is there. Like, you learn isn't English like the most difficult language to learn? It is.
For a foreigner, I'm sure it is, because there are very few rules and they contradict themselves.
Yeah, there's so much nuance between.
And it's like, but you learned English. You are a native English. Like, the evidence is actually already there, but we don't, like, the way you stated that so simply is like, wait a second, like, give yourself some credit. You just figured that out. Huh.
It is one of those things, because we often, there are so many motivational things and so many things out there, the power of the mind, the power of what you're capable. And you often just think, I can't do that. It's impossible for whatever reason. And it's such a simple pairing to say, well, you'll learn to walk and talk when you couldn't even lift your head when you were first born. Like, we take it for granted as a natural human condition. Well, if that's a natural human condition, why is that not a natural human condition for other things down the road?
No, I'm not sure. I just think, okay, we're all monkeys in a sense, but we can be trained. It just, some of us need more time. Okay, some people walk, I'm not sure how many months, I'd say 6, and some at 12. Some talk at 2, some talk at 4, whenever it is. It's a spread. So I think I could learn anything. It may not be faster than anyone else. Going back to my parents, my dad graduates from high school as valedictorian. The next day he joins the Army. My mother, at the end of World War II, her mother and her brother had just died at the end of the war. She's skinning rabbits at her dad's out and shooting. A lot of people had a lot worse. I grew up in the suburbs of Detroit. Things were good back then. Detroit was, for a while, once the richest city in America. So there were opportunities. We didn't grow up, rich, but it was well off in the sense that probably better than the average person in the States. The education was public and good. So it was public. It was, I hate to say it, probably a democratic utopia in a sense, but obviously with problems. Detroit's segregated, but I'm just saying, you grew up in this attitude that you could do what you want. You just have to do it. It's not going to be handed to you. It may not be easy, but you just have to, the one foot in front of the other mentality. And it was also during the period where followed the rules and good people are rewarded, bad people are put in jail. The kind of things now, and you look around, it's like, wow. Sometimes it doesn't matter what you do, and doesn't matter what you say. It's I think I grew up at the peak of the American dream, but then again, because it's me, I feel that way. I mean, maybe statistically, or maybe it's not true at all, but it just it feels a special time to me, obviously, because it happened to me.
Yeah, when I think for many it was, right, and then there's others it wasn't. I mean, you mentioned segregation in Detroit, and I mean there are groups of people that it wasn't a boon for, but economically, I think the numbers would prove that out.
No, but as a kid, my first job, I'm washing dishes for $2.50 an hour, and there were sometimes I can go to the movies, for under $4. 2-3 years later, I remember in my off in the summers from college, I drove cars off assembly line in Sterling Heights, Michigan, and I'm making like 5 times that now. So I can buy 5 movie tickets every hour instead of 1. So life was, 5 times better. I mean, but we're talking the difference for a 15-year-old versus an 18-year-old. Yeah. But that's how I used to equate it. It's like, wow, things are getting much better. But nowadays, think about it. Now in the States, they're fighting for $15 an hour. In LA, that's a movie ticket. So it's going backwards, back to when I was 15. So there's adults, doing adult jobs, working in a factory, not like me washing dishes when you're a kid. There's like the paper route, the delivery pizzas, the things you traditionally did as a kid are now adult jobs because, well, a lot of those jobs don't exist anymore. And you're talking about like in the factories, it's not just that the jobs are gone. The jobs that remain are replaced by automation. Mm-hmm. So that's why, and I hate that everything goes back to politics in the States, but sorry, for one, coal is dirty, no matter how you scrub it. But we should get away from coal, especially if global warming's an issue. But those jobs are gone because now there's machines that could do the work of 100 men. Yeah. It's like the factories that do remain in Detroit that kick out twice as many cars now, they do it with 20 times less people. You don't need a factory of 10,000. I hate to say it, it's mostly robots, and you have 50 or 500 people watching the robots.
John Oliver did a really good piece on mining, and Trump campaigned on this very strongly, talking about how Obama got rid of their jobs, and like some of the CEOs of mining companies hopped on that bandwagon, like, yeah, he did, as they're firing people, like as the person who actually has to do with the jobs, and they were replacing jobs because they could strip a side of a mountain with 2 people and machinery, where they used to have crews of hundreds to do it.
I think the reduction happened starting in the 90s, where every 10 employees were replaced by 1 in a machine, right? Like the reduction of workforce.
Well, it's starting to even happen at fast food. So like what's happening is, as car like Toyota, Honda, all the Detroit car manufacturers have started to get rid of like some of the robots and machines that they've used on the factory lines. Fast food, pizza, McDonald's, like they're starting to look at, well, how much can we automate in our daily operations? Like it's because it comes down to efficiency, the dollar, like it's that age old, like how much can I get for how less or how little?
Yeah, I mean, you come to the McDonald's in Rome, you don't even interact with a person at first. There's a bunch of touch screens. You place your order there. You're not holding up anyone in line because there's so many of these screens everywhere. Or you can do it with an app on your phone. And then I just think ahead with this automated in terms of driverless cars and trucks. You always thought, and this may sound bad, but it's like, okay, I can always be a truck driver. Thought always, if I ever need a job, I could drive something, a taxi, a truck or something. But in 10 years, are all those jobs gone too?
Yeah, which when you think about it, puts us, the U.S., in a real big predicament when you see where we are as far like on a global landscape and from an education perspective. As we keep sliding down the math scales and science scales, the language scales, it's like, well, we need highly skilled information workers in order to have high tech jobs in the future, yet we're not producing that workforce. And like Keith, you weren't on it. There was a call the other day. I heard from one of our coworkers that their school is no longer giving out grades. It's
there
Are
are
they
a
getting
lot
the
of schools that do
crocodiles?
they're giving out participation. It's like the trophy that everybody gets
Okay.
in a sports thing. Like they're doing that in school. Like, thanks for showing up. You did it. Thumbs up. Like we're
Yeah,
not.
but I
Wow.
mean that's and I would argue that's a limiting perspective because education has changed. And it's the old adage, right? If you teach a fish to climb a tree, he's going to fail 100% of the time. That's how the traditional education system that we find succeeds: A, B, C, D, E, F. Well, I guess there's no E in that. But that fails for a lot of people, right? So there are other school systems. I'm reluctant to judge that idea that we're not giving grades anymore because I hear that from people in my family. Oh, can you believe this changed? It's like, yeah, well, it changed for us from when you did it and you had your parents had a problem with it. Like these things evolve. So I don't know the context or structure around that, but I think it's interesting on the workforce piece because when you think about the nature of automation, at the end of the day, businesses, the number one piece of overhead is employee, right? People cost more money than anything else. And if the number one outcome that they're looking for isn't to give jobs, it's to earn profits. So how are you going to earn your most profits? By cutting your biggest cost. Well, how are you going to cut your biggest cost? You're going to find a way. At the end of the day, the businesses have this structure ultimately creates a system as technology advances and people advance. And then I think there's a cultural aspect to it too, where, like you said, Pete, when you were a kid, every job was an opportunity for some reason. And I don't know, maybe you have some perspective on this. You've been around a little bit longer than we have, where that shift went to devalue other jobs. It's like, if you don't go to college, you can't do anything. Oh, you've got to work at McDonald's. Okay, well, McDonald's could be a living for somebody, and I still want to go. A lot of people want fast food, so you may need to work at McDonald's.
Here's one area where it might be, and were universities always the big business that they are now?
I don't know if they were always the big business, but they innovation leads to patents, so they were always creators for that. And it's funny, just to take a step back, that the term job creator, I can't stand because, like you said, businesses are in business to make money. No one's ever said, I want to open a business and employ people. Excuse me. They may have to employ people. They want to make money and they want to make things. Henry Ford was, a forward thinker by paying his workers a daily wage, but he needed those people. He didn't want to always keep fighting for the low wage seeker. It's like, I'll pay a good wage. People will want to come to work with me. Takes out the equation finding employees, which was a huge problem for him to keep his factories going. So I just make it a wage where I never have to worry about employing anyone. I'll have people at the door. But that doesn't happen anymore because now they've got, at one time, Detroit's the richest city in the world. They're kicking out cars. The people I met, it was funny because they used to take me to the Union Hall. We get our beer and a shot. It's like, here's our college kid. It's like they were mostly from the South, Tennessee and Kentucky. They were all high school dropouts. They're making big money in an auto factory. Their wives were at home. They had the cabin up north. And, we're doing the same job. I want to go on to college. I want to do something else. I always knew I wanted to work for NASA. But it was nothing wrong what they were doing. And it was nothing wrong what I was doing. And it was like, there was a camaraderie that we're doing the same job, even if temporarily. And then I don't know when all of a sudden they're like, well, we can shift these factories from Detroit to Mississippi. Instead of paying them $80,000 a year, they'll do it for $18,000 a year. And it's not like the price of cars went down. That profit just goes to the shareholders. And then somebody's, well, you know what? If we do this in China or Mexico, it's just pitting worker against worker. And they've got you to the point where it's like, you're thankful. I mean, think about it. The people of Mississippi, they vote the people in the office that give $1 billion. I don't know if it's Mississippi or South Carolina or Alabama that gives $1 billion in tax breaks to Mercedes to move this factory in. There's a reason that they can pay these people less money is because Mississippi or Alabama or South Carolina is now subsidizing this company.
You're still paying for it. You're just
the taxpayer. So you're raising your cost of living just so your neighbor can have an $18,000. I'm not saying that $18,000 a year is not a good job, but at one time it paid $80,000 a year, and we weren't fighting Michigan versus Mississippi If you ask me, I would say it happened under Reagan when he fired the air traffic controllers. Also, when there started this huge transfer of wealth from the, when they say, well, it's unfair that 2% of the people pay 80% of the taxes, and yet it's true, it's unfair. Those 2% earn 98% of the money. It's unfair that people who don't earn pay more of a burden than people who have more money than they'll ever need to deal with. But they've set up a system, and I don't know when it started, but it's got us fighting each other for minuscule jobs. And we are thankful that we, if you just watch these campaign rallies, people are happy for any job that's coming to town. And if you read the newspaper, what's moving in, even in Detroit, when they open a new factory, everyone's exciting, but they were getting paid $8 an hour, $9 an hour. What happened to that job that paid $28 an hour? Well, it's not coming back, but I don't know. They just got to fight for the one that you have now.
What
exactly?
Why do you say the air traffic control? Why do you think that event? I'm curious, just because that's a huge event in my life, because my dad became a controller on the heels of that. So I'm curious, like, what do you think that signaled, or what do you think that kicked off?
Breaking of unions. I mean, if you think about it, just 100 years ago in the States, kids weren't going to school. They're losing fingers in textile plants, along the eastern seaboard. 10 years after that, factory workers are being shot and killed. 10 years after that, you have the Flint sit-down strikes, and boom, it changed overnight. Factory workers of any sort, and it didn't have to be a union factory, and it didn't have to even be a factory job. All wages were raised. That the middle class, think about it. Detroit's success was also its burden. The history of the world, no city had more people owning their own homes. So you didn't have to live in a tenement building. You're just, I'm not saying it derogatorily, you're just a factory worker, just the normal job, and yet you're living larger than 98% of the people in the world. And then after firing in the air traffic controllers, it didn't happen overnight, but it keeps progressing down. We're to the point where people are cheering that they're going to open a coal mine. Think how ludicrous that is. That'd be like people in Detroit cheering that the buggy whip factory is reopening. It's not happening. Or the typewriter factory.
I think it's interesting, especially as it relates to the concept of MAGA, right? Make America great again. Make America great again. This idea that everything you just framed up, right? Job opportunities, wages, all of these things that people perceive as a better or greater time for them, right? Based on their personal life experience. As Rodney said, not for all, because certainly, right. In the 60s, 70s, 50s, 40s, 30s, America hasn't been great for a lot of people for a long time. But that concept somehow, and this is the political landscape of the United States, has become a politicized concept. It's politics. These people did this to us. When every single day we talk about these different jobs as less than or lesser than, it has eroded the way we see each other in a working way. Like you said, unions, as an example, they exist for a reason. They have become more political than necessarily helpful to the broader ecosystem. So corporations vilify unions because they cost them more money. So let's make it political, and then people buy into it, believe it, that ultimately it's the political machine that's keeping them down versus the nature of the business and the way business functions and operates. I'm not saying, free market is the devil, but at the same time, we all need to realize what's important is each other and how we all support each other, earn money, prop each other up, and make sure that we're taking care of this world that may not just be mine. But businesses have interests. Businesses, for whatever reason in the States, we have glorified business. because you can make $1 million out of being it. And I'm not saying businesses are evil, but businesses are self-interested. At the end of the day, they want profit. We want to live the life we want to live. And if that's working for somebody else, great. But, I shouldn't have to do it for $8 an hour when, you talk about fairness. It's not fair that the top 2% pay 80% of the taxes. Well, it's also not fair that I make a wage, not me personally, that makes me have to decide whether I feed myself or I feed my kids.
Right.
Like it's so backwards.
When by the way, there's more than enough food for everybody here.
Without a doubt. And when I was saying about the small percentage of people that pay the huge percentage of taxes, it's not enough. They should pay even more because they earn even more. It is interesting because how did we get to this point? The only time businesses are aligned with employees are when their interests are self-aligned, and which is rare. Like you said, a business wants to maximize profit. And I think, okay, I grew up, the Reagan Revolution and all that, and that was the headlights that I saw. But I changed my mind quickly when I moved to California. Hughes, and this is the event, Hughes Aircraft had like $250 million in profit. Not that they just eked out, but they made $250 million for their shareholders. Turns out it wasn't enough. They turned around and they laid off like 20,000 people in the Los Angeles area. Some of these people I knew. But it's like, that's when I realized for corporations, there is not enough. You know what I mean? It's like they made $250 million profit and they rewarded the people who helped them make that money by firing them. No, just in the long run, they'll make even more.
Well, it's all about year over year, quarter over quarter earnings. Like, how did you perform this quarter over last quarter? What'd you do for me this quarter? And like, kind of like what Kent said, like, I don't think goals are bad. I don't think it's bad to want to achieve. I think it is bad to want to achieve on the backs of others and not reward those who helped you get there. Like, I don't know. Like, it seems like there's some kind of a like the basic relationship. And I can't speak to this personally because I didn't work in the 70s in the U.S. But it seems like the basic company to employee relationship is so strained now. It's like a very tenuous, like, I'm just here because I got to pay a bill. And like, we're just keeping you here because we can get this much out of you. But as soon as we can't, you're gone. Where it used to be like people used to work at Ford for 30, like they retire there. That was their career. That doesn't happen very often at one place now.
And the relationship of people is amongst each other as it relates. Like that concept of you should be thankful for the job you have. And it's a scarcity model because someone else doesn't have the job. You have it. Be grateful for it. Well,
yeah.
So basically,
could also thank you.
Yeah, like so basically, what you're telling me is even if I have no job, I make no money, right? So if you pay me $1 an hour to work 90 hours a week, I should be thankful for it because I could have no money. Somebody else has no money. That's not an equal system of employment that at the employee level, it perpetuates itself. I'm happy. You should be happy too. Right? It's the
also
divide of men and women, right? Like there's unequal pay. Yeah, but you're still making a lot of money.
It's also, I mean, like that's true. Like the whole like, oh, you could be making no money. And I use this argument like to myself to keep me doing things all the time. But like just because there is a child starving in Africa doesn't mean that my situation here couldn't be better or like isn't bad. Like those two things can both exist.
Correct. They are not mutually exclusive. Yeah.
That's true.
You said you live in Italy now.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is it's an eye opener. And I was thinking about this and this is one of the things that bug me the most now. It's this hierarchy in job. It's like when this reporter, I can't remember who it was, that was asking President Trump a few days ago a question, and he's basically, I'm not going to tell you. And she's like, well, I don't want to get in this fight with you. He goes, well, it's not a fight to get into because I'm president and you're not. It's like we have this pecking order. You know what? But in Italy, you see the people with the orange pants who sweep the streets every day. They may not be as prestigious as the brain surgeon, but you know what? I don't need a brain surgeon today. If those people don't come and clean my streets, it's going to smell and rats are going to come. So in Rome, we have these collective garbage bins, and they're cleaned every day, even on Christmas, even on New Year's. So there are people working all the holidays for all of us. And to me, that's an important job. Where in the States, bus drivers, garbage collectors, let's face it, they're not very prestigious. If my bus driver doesn't show up, I'm not making it to work. If the garbage collector doesn't come up, my city's going to smell. These are important jobs, and they're having coffee along with everyone else, with the senator, with the banker, with the tour guide, with everybody. It's a community. Where in the States, you have this huge separation, rich behind these fences. When I lived in LA, I drove past Bel Air a million times. I never went in because I wasn't allowed in. But in Rome, obviously the rich person, they have the top floor of a building where the rest of us live, communally, multiple condos on a floor. But we walk the same streets. We see each other on, sometimes in the metro. Otherwise they're taking a car. But you see everybody, the whole community. Where in the States, everything is segregated. Maybe in Detroit and Chicago by color, other places maybe by religion, but definitely by economic status. Now, I always considered myself lucky. My mother literally was off a boat. My mother never spoke English. My friends, some friends would be mean as kids, like, what? Is your mother just off a boat? In fact, she was. My dad, was only a couple generations from Ireland. I was fortunate. I was born in the States. I got an Italian passport. My mother, American passport. My mother was Italian. I got an Italian passport. So I got 2 passports for doing nothing. What if I would have been born in some poor African country? My life would be totally different just on the sheer luck. So I know immigration's a big problem here and in the U.S., but I'm under the simple impression if you're not hurting me, let's not go crazy and pay too much in taxes, but pay some taxes. Who cares where you're from? But again, I'm a product of where I grew up. When I worked at NASA, all my bosses were women, and all the people of color I knew were PhD in astrophysics. So when people would be like, oh, you know how those black people are? I'm like, yeah, they're smarter than you. And they'd be like, you know how women are? Like, well, you better listen to them because they'll fire you. So, I grew up in an era where there wasn't this male-woman divide and sense of power. All my bosses were women, so it seemed like women were more powerful. And it wasn't. And obviously, growing up outside Detroit, I don't want to make light of it. I didn't know many black people because it was so segregated. So the few that I knew of color were all well educated. So obviously I know the whole world's not like this, but our own individual perspective, it's important. And this is the thing. Gandhi had said the most important thing for a well-functioning democracy is a well-educated electorate. And people don't know the story of the U.S. They don't know that we didn't want a king.
You bring up, Rodney and I, we've had guests on, and we talk a lot about this idea of representation from the I want to be represented perspective. But I think that story is an unbelievable example of the power of representation from the other side of it, where someone sees the representation of the Black community as PhDs or women as bosses and powerful. Like, we don't talk about these things because there's some hokey pokey feeling, right? It is a really great example. I'm glad you shared that story because I think it's super important.
I just think it took away from me. Anyone I meet, I don't have that stereotype. Well, it's a woman. I better not listen to her for this reason, or this person doesn't look like me. I shouldn't listen for this reason. They're an authority. They've gotten their degree, and they should be listened to just like anyone else. But
so you know more about the politics than a lot of people I talk to, like American politics. Well, like Italian and American. Like your interest in it is interesting to me because I am trying to get people to be more interested in local politics and understand how much that actually affects them versus the national picture. Like to your point there, like the federal government, like roads and big picture cargo trading, like all that kind of stuff is there, but like day to day, that's not really that important to you. Like Wow, like, do you have any thoughts on how to get people interested in like the things that are actually more important?
Actually, I don't know if this is the reason why I'm so interested, but okay. I mean, if I think of my earliest childhood memories, other than the space program, which is a government endeavor, and it's important. I mean, because the government, they're always saying, "Oh, we don't want to pick winners and losers." That's all they do. When you decide to tax somebody more than somebody else, you've picked. When you decide to build a battleship instead of a school or a sounding rocket, you've picked. But when I was a kid, there were millages that you had to vote for, and it was always, am I going to play sports or not? It depended on that vote. So it was important politics. And then when my brother moved to Columbia, Maryland, which was one of these program cities, everything is planned. You need a permission to paint your fence, or if you could have a fence. So talk about politics at the local level. Depending on who you vote for, it depends whether or not you can have a fence. Depends what color you can paint your fence. And then for me, it was, can I play football this year? So local politics means everything. And to this day, I mean, your sheriff, your dog collector. When I lived in California, I never voted for the things that didn't, like for school board. I don't have kids. Why should I tell some other parents what their kids should be doing? So I wouldn't vote for those. But anything that could affect me, I voted for because it could affect me. Where today, I mean, another thing that really drives me nuts is you should be forced to read any issue, but people go in, they just pull the lever R or pull the lever D without, a lot of times, and this is fun to do on my tours. So I'll meet Americans and they're really into politics and they're going on. And then I'll find out what state they're from and I'll ask them who their senators are and they can't tell me their names. And I know them. I'm like, why should I know them? I don't even live in your state. But you have all these opinions on politics, but you don't know who, in theory,
you don't know who you should call to have an effect on that.
How much would you say the dichotomy of a two-party system, because our republic has not always been just two parties, right? And the two parties that exist have changed and evolved, where the Democratic Party was much more supportive of slavery in its history than it is now. How much would you say that plays a role, seeing that you have 19 parties in Italy that's certainly been broken down and heading into a two-party like system? Do you see that being a problem or a big contributor to the problem? What are your thoughts?
You can look at it both ways, but I would think it's an advantage. Again, we don't all have the same views, and to put us in two boxes is very difficult. And with the way we have it now, it's like, okay, the winner is the winner, and screw the loser. We're going to do whatever we want. Where when you have many parties and many people that have to pull, you can't have half the boat pulling the oar one way and half going opposite. You got to pull together. And so by having a lot of differing parties, you realize we're not all going to think alike. We all have to get along. We're either going to, start drilling holes in the boats to screw ourselves, or we're going to make this thing work together. Where in the States, it seems like there is no us anymore. It's we and they. There's no, we're Americans first. We're Republicans. And okay, it's easy to blame the people in power now because all you have to do is go back to Obama's inauguration when Boner from Ohio and McConnell get together and they say, our only goal is to make him a one-term president. Now, if they would say we're going to make every American rich and happy and we're going to vote our guys in, fine. But they just said what they were going to do. We're going to, anything he wants to do, we're going to block, no matter how good it is. And back to representative government. Okay, so you're from West Virginia. Your senator should say we should all be snorting coal dust and we're going to put coal dust instead of sugar in our coffee. The rest of the country, the other senators are like, well, dudes, let's slow down. So it's like you'd expect a Michigan senator to be pro-auto and just like a California senator to be pro-film industry or pro-orange growing.
Pro-kale.
But as a country, you have to okay, the rest of us should get together and temper that. But there's no more tempering based on geography. It's based on politics.
This I don't have many pet peeves these days, but I'll call it fanboyism. I like Google, so everything Google does is great. Not looking at the individual things that they do. I like Xbox. I don't like PlayStation. I like red. I don't like blue. Like it's in like this, and it's the simplification thing our brain does, I think, to make it, but it drives me crazy.
It's an interesting point that you make, Rodney, that we all do to, for whatever reason, love what we love and validate that we love it, so it's the best.
I mean, I get it from a neuroscience standpoint. It bothers me.
It bothers me too, because I think to Pete's point, in Italy, it doesn't have to be that way. Right? Like the two topics, like you said, Pete, that you don't talk about, religion and politics, especially at the dinner table. Well, that's where it happens. It's the concept of breaking bread.
Like, you break that bread,
one place to have that
It's
conversation.
Funny. Just today, my aunt was mad at me because, and it'll be over in 2 minutes, but it was a heated discussion because she was quoting, biblical verses, and I'm like, well, how do you know that's what was said then? And it just out of the blue, we're talking about football 1 minute, then she says something, and it comes up, and in the States you always avoid the sensitive subject, but here it's like, okay, it's not that you go for it, but it was brought up. I disagree with it. I just want to know how you know something, and it's talked about in, and at the end we both agree we're not going to ever agree, but we're not going to stop talking about it. It's an important subject.
That same cousin joined the Republican coalition or whatever student body Republican representation at her extremely liberal school in Connecticut. And she had friends defriend her. It's like, nope, you're not going to be my friend anymore. It's like, why?
Wow.
Like,
that is sad.
I don't functionally, and that's the state of where we're at, right? There are so many people who, another podcast I listened to, was it Minnesota?
Minnesota?
It's all about trying to, there's a subset of the Democratic Party that wants to bring in the quote unquote pro-life Democrat. And there are so many people who are like, no, that's not possible. Yeah. You're a Democrat. Nope. You cannot be pro-life. Like, this doesn't make any sense. Why?
It was like Arkansas.
No, it was somewhere up north. I had to
Rodney, when you were in Rome, did you see the Capuchin crypts?
Yes. So that has been I will call a defining moment in my life. I'm actually designing a tattoo around some of the stuff in the crypts.
Nice. This is one thing. Okay. It's hard to put your life, okay, this is only business, this is only pleasure. Life is life. If politics are important, it infuses its way. Just like Michigan, Ohio State's important. That's why on all my tours, I was telling you, I'll always make the joke. If I'm going to blame anyone for anything today, it's going to be Hitler, Napoleon, or people from Ohio, because it's always close, to the vest. So when you go into the Capuchin crypts, you see 4,000 sets of other human beings nailed and wired to the walls, in a nice way, if you could say that, done by religious people to their brethren for teaching purposes. They never expected me or you or anyone else to see them. They did this for their own reasons. But what I like the most out of it, you have these full skeletons in their habits. They're bent over in humility and supplication. And they're telling you, they're servants. They serve the sick and the poor on behalf of their beliefs, on behalf of the God they believe in. And I always say, every tour, I'm like, I just wish our politicians would remember who they serve. Back to Keith's points about being represented. You are their bosses, but they treat you in a manner that if you treated your boss like that, you'd be fired. It's just interesting. And it's sad for me in Ohio that you have term limits. When people had the big argument about term limits, you do have term limits. You can vote people out. And it's sad. I mean, think about it, like, okay, whether you liked Obama or not, I thought he was an adult. I thought he was intelligent. And I thought it would, the definition of the word thoughtful. He thought, he didn't react. He didn't, visceral, this feels right, I'm going to throw a brick through a window. He thought about what he was going to do. He thought about the repercussions and the ramifications where the current president doesn't. If you have a great president, why wouldn't you want one more term out of them? Or if I'm not a fan of Kasich one way or the other, but if he's good for Ohio, why not allow him to continue? And it's especially these states that put limits on their representatives. Over time, they move up into committees. They may even chair a committee. They even do more good for your state. Why would you preclude that? Just because FDR won 4 elections. The Republicans didn't like it, and they changed the Constitution. Why must it filter all the way down? It's one of these things that it just feels good. You're right. We should give somebody else a chance. That seems the American way. That's more fair. But if somebody's doing such a great job, why stop them or her from continuing to do so?
2 thoughts. One, on the Capuchin monks. Yeah, like I said, like I loved that. And and I just finished a neuroscience book, and one of the first things it talked about is that everything regresses to the mean, negative, positive. And so like the brain's mean is survival. So like when you're a representative of people, like you may be super thankful that they elected you like 5 days after, but 40 days after, 60 days after, 2 years later, you're just surviving. Like you're not really worried about them unless there are constant reminders. So like the Capuchin monks, they go into the crypts daily, like multiple times a day, and remember their purpose. They remember that, like for them, their faith, and like they remember that, like those remains of their brethren, like that soon they will be that. Like this life is not permanent, and they're going to be that one day. So that they have to stay dedicated to their purpose. Like they have a daily reminder. And like, I don't think our senators and our representatives have that daily reminder. So they regress to the mean of survival. And this goes to my second point, why I disagree with you on term limits, because there is no reminder. The danger and the problem becomes that they become solely focused on getting reelected, not serving the people. So while Kasich or somebody may be good for the state overall, or they may be a smart individual or good thinker, like how many things, and I think some of the things you said about term limits make a lot of sense. Like we should look at that. However, in most cases, and I think we should look at this from a numbers perspective, like how often are the people being served versus the individual who is holding that seat?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's the same thing, when it comes to, capitalism or anything like we talked about earlier with companies. Like at the end of the day, their survival is to make a profit regardless. Even if it's in their best interest to pay people $15 an hour in the long term, maybe they're having a bad quarter and maybe they're shareholders, whatever the case may be, and they're going to do something that's morally repugnant, but it impacts the bottom line. Because I too would disagree on the term limits, and I thought about that the other day, a couple of weeks ago, actually, as it relates to Kasich, because I don't think we have a better replacement for him. So it's like,
but you're codifying an option that you already have.
Yep.
If you think this guy has become too self-serving, that he's or she is not putting forth the constituents' best interest, you just vote him out of office.
And I agree with that on its face. I agree with that in its principle, but at the same time, and this is where I think fundamentally, the two-party system actually hurts us, is the fact that a general election in November of 2016, we had 270 million registered voters or potential registered voters. How many people showed up to the polls?
Half of that.
120, 130, maybe 140, right? So a little over half of that. So, yes, from a statistical standpoint, we can say, well, that is a large representative sample of the overall sentiment of the United States. But how many people voted for one because they weren't voting for the other? Or how many people, right? There's just so many pieces of human behavior that go into the voting booth that may not be educated, or it may not be, if you're working 3 jobs, but you still find the value of voting, like, how are you going to find time to not vote D or R? Whereas,
it simplifies it, right? It's just easy. Like I can go in and I make my selection. And I think, Pete, you're right. In a perfect world, like I think that's how it works. I talked to a representative out here, and she said, you know how many people show up at midterms? 20% of eligible voters. So you know what happens? We only have to talk to 20% of the people, like, because everybody else isn't paying attention. So we can talk to our base and fire them up because they're the ones that are going to show up. And then I can I can stay in office as long as I want because the people aren't paying attention. They're sleeping at the wheel when they need to make that decision to codify whether or not this person is doing the right things for us. And then that's how
Well-
things like gerrymandering happen. That's how things like all of this shit. That's how it all happens because it happens in the night when nobody's paying attention.
Right. It all goes together. I mean, money's a big issue, but okay, the country is stuck in ways. Okay, I mean, look at the Senate. The Senate looks like a very niche club. It's probably the thing that's sustained the longest. It looks the way the country did in the 18th century. I mean, the system they set up was great for this small country, and at the time, it's 3 million people, sequestered along the coast of this continent. Now there's people in Hawaii and Alaska, and people of Puerto Rico should have representation if they're part of the U.S. And same with the people of the District of Columbia. We are living in the 21st century.
Now, I do think what you just said, Pete, I think would be an interest. It is the way where you could get rid of term limits, in my opinion, and have it not turn into everything that Rodney mentioned. Is you have a month and a half of campaigning, the rest of the year is governing because you aren't allowed to campaign, and you take the finance out of it to say you get this many ads equally distributed amongst people who are running for office, and this is how they get distributed and whatever the case. So you create an equal playing field, because at the end of the day, being a politician isn't about having the most money, at least in theory. You get rid of that,
Right.
you can get rid of term limits, because at that point, you actually are putting it in a space that allows for campaigning.
Or we could go real old school. Who was it? The Greeks? Was it the Greeks or the Romans that had a corporal punishment rule for senators that didn't uphold their promises?
Well, in Roman times, elected officials who took bribes, and look at the current government, and those who perjured themselves in court, and again, think of the current government, they were thrown to their deaths off the Terpian Rocks.
Look, I'm
So
not
they
saying
were
we go
literally
there. I'm just saying we should talk about it.
I have an
and
uncle.
then maybe term limits will fix themselves.
I don't agree with I don't believe in killing anyone for any reason. If you think it's so egregious to take a life that you're going to punish them by taking their life, it kind of, to me, it doesn't make sense. But it just means the Romans, they realized that if a politician lies in court, especially, the courts don't work if people are allowed to lie. So they made it the greatest punishment if you lied. If you take a bribe in office, you cannot be serving the people that elected you. You're clearly serving the person that paid you. They realize the government won't work and courts won't work if these things happen. But if you think about the U.S. government right now, look at how many cabinet officials are being busted for a lot of improprieties dealing with money from the outside.
Yeah. So Pete, as we kind of come to an abrupt stop to a conversation that I think we could continue to have, and
Easily.
didn't even get to some of the other things that fall into your area of expertise in climate change and science. So we might have to have you back so we could dig into that. So look for a potential invite. What I'm hoping
love to, and I apologize that I took us off.
No, I thought it was great.
This was all productive.
We often say we want to talk more about politics and have open and honest conversations around it. Even if passion gets the better of us, we can end this discussion civilly. That civil place to end the discussion would be to say, if there's anything you wanted to leave our audience with, that you want them to take away, what would that be?
I don't know. I mean, well, from my perspective, it's you always have to have hope, and you don't know what's coming tomorrow. You could be surprised, but I mean, like I said earlier, I consider myself a well-educated monkey. I learned how to walk and talk. I learned how to do a lot of other things. I never, in my wildest dreams, thought as a kid I would be, living in Italy. I mean, even though it was always considered like home, my mother was from there. It always felt better. But I mean, I considered, I would be in the States until I died. And I don't know, it just, life gives you some interesting things. I mean, the more education you get, the more opportunities that you take, the more people that you meet. And that's, I mean, so often, and this is the one question that just drives me nuts. people ask, is this all you do? When I'm like doing tours for them, it's how degrading. It's like, you seem to be an intelligent person. You should be doing more. But I choose to do this. I get to meet a lot of people. I mean, I try writing. Nobody's bought my stuff yet. And I always joke, because I wrote a screenplay, nobody bought it. I wrote a novel, nobody bought it. Somebody asked me what kind of writing pays best, and I just joke, I assume ransom notes. But maybe we'll try that next. But you guys are doing something that I find very fascinating, because to me, the biggest thing, and I try this on tours, there's so many, well-heeled Republicans that travel and they hire me, and we couldn't disagree more. But it's so difficult to be able to just to talk without being viscerally emotional. Like, they find out, okay, this is funny. I was just telling somebody asked in the tour, where can I get good gelato? And I'm like, this is not my favorite gelato place. It may be in my top 5, but it's Rome's most famous. That's not about Giolitti. And I said, when President Obama was here, he took his daughters for gelato there. I'm not sure how he got there, but I'm sure he asked somebody in the Italian government, where can I take my girls for good gelato? And this is what they told them. I'm sure the President of the United States is not being misled on where you can get good gelato. And I got a review, and this person was, well, Pete's just pumping his liberal agenda down our throat. It's in Italy, we all have this saying, you make your own movie. We all watch the same event, but we make our own movie in our head. We edit it, and we cut out what we want, and we remember the scene in our head like a movie. And my scene might be different from your scene, but I don't know. I would just say, do what you guys are doing. Talk to more people, listen to more points of view. I mean, obviously we don't agree on everything, but maybe we can try to convince each other in the next time we talk.